Howdy, folks. Dominic here. The narrative will resume in a few days, but in the meantime, I wanted to let you know about a new podcast dedicated to Egyptology. Voices of Ancient Egypt is run by Dr. Melinda Nelson-Hurst. Dr. Nelson-Hurst is an Egyptologist with years of experience teaching at the university level, working in Egypt, and training students to read real ancient Egyptian texts. The podcast has a blend of solo deep dives and conversations with experts and everyday enthusiasts of Egyptology. It brings together ancient Egyptian history, beliefs, and language, and shows you how learning hieroglyphs is possible, no matter your age, background, or schedule. To celebrate the launch of the show, I asked Dr. Melinda Nelson-Hurst to come on the podcast and introduce Voices of Ancient Egypt. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brief little interview discussion with another ancient Egyptian history podcaster. My guest today is Dr. Melinda Nelson-Hurst, who recently launched a new podcast called Voices of Ancient Egypt. And we're going to talk about that podcast in more detail in just a moment. But first, I wanted to reach out to Melinda to get a sense of how you came into Egyptology and ancient Egyptian history and what draws you to it. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today, Dominic. Thank you for having me. I think in terms of where I started, I think most people have a similar story. You may as well, which is I encountered ancient Egypt as a child, in my case, in a museum. I often hear from people it might be a museum or a book or a movie that they encountered. And as we were talking about before we recorded, it's such a visual culture, such a visually appealing culture. I think those things tend to draw us in at the beginning. So I was fortunate to grow up in a metropolitan area where there was a museum with an Egyptian collection nearby. I live in the United States, so we don't have a whole lot of Egyptology here, but I did have that. So that sparked my initial interest, and I wanted to learn everything I could about it. And, around 10 to 12 years old, I wanted to be an Egyptologist, and that was my goal. I didn't exactly go straight there, had definitely curved around with some different things through my teens to early 20s. Mm-hmm. But I found that, when it came to trying to learn on my own at that time, there wasn't really much of anything out there other than if you went to university. And usually, here in the States, we don't have very many universities that have Egyptology. And so really, it turned out the only way I was going to really be able to study ancient Egypt in depth was to get a graduate degree, because even undergraduate and university here, very rarely you can get almost anything on ancient Egypt. So that is eventually what I ended up doing and getting my PhD in Egyptology at the University of Pennsylvania. It's one of the things I love about being able to podcast and do other things now is making this more available to people in ways that I didn't have when I was starting out. So one of the things that hooked me from the beginning and still does today really is learning about the people of ancient Egypt. It's one of the things that fascinates me the most. It's where my research ended up going, and it still colors the way that I do things in other areas as well.
Mm-hmm. That's quite a common story that I hear from most Egyptologists. It does seem to get its hooks into people quite young, I think. Mm-hmm. There's something quite special about it that particularly appeals to children. And one thing I wanted to ask you, sort of just to get a sense of where you're coming from in terms of the stories you want to tell. So I wanted to ask you, what are a couple of people or events or monuments or anything at all from ancient Egypt that really jumps out to you when you think of Egyptology and the ancient world?
There's so many things, so it's hard to pick. But if we want to look at sort of maybe more of the side of the text end of things, when you get these documents that really shed light on family relationships, I find really interesting. So, like, for example, you have Naunocht from the New Kingdom and her immediate pair. Sometimes people refer to it as a will. It's a little bit different than that. But in any case, she disinherits, almost half of her children in it, and talks about how it's because they didn't take care of her in her old age. And she's giving stuff to other children and how, one gets more than the other. And it's fascinating because it also gives you a look into her marriages and stuff like that, because and inheritance practices, because she talks about how these children can still inherit from their father, but just not from her. And so you can see how the property is divided between the couple, and she's in charge of her portion and how it's divvied up between the children, and also references this property that largely she got from her first husband, actually, who had passed away. So I love documents like that. And going to like the Middle Kingdom, like I mentioned, is sort of my favorite area, I would say. So like the letters of Hakanacht in this way, I love because of the unique window it gives us actually into both family and business relationships of the time. So Hakanacht, I actually talked about Hakanacht recently on my podcast, so people can check that out too. But Hakanacht is you know, I wouldn't call him middle class because that's a bit of a controversial topic for the Middle Kingdom, but he's sort of, somewhat well off. He's a landowner, but he's not at the top of society, high, super high up. And he has a priestly job that he has to travel away from home for part of the year. And so the series of letters of his were found, interestingly, kind of oddly, in somebody else's tomb that we can't quite tell why. But in any case, we have some of these letters, and he is writing home from when he's away and trying to deal with the various issues that clearly everybody's writing to him about and complaining. So he's responding to all these complaints and concerns from people at home, and he's complaining much himself as well. So at one point, he's talking to sort of his head person at home who's filling in for him, Marisu, and complaining to him about the grain he's been sent, saying, "You're sending me this old dried up barley. And I bet, he basically says, I bet you're eating the good stuff at home. And well, you're sending me this dried up stuff." And all these conflicts that are going on. So he's trying to mediate between his wife and his other family members too. He seems to have been probably recently remarried. We don't know what the story is with whoever he was married to before that, whether, she passed away or they got divorced or what. But in any case, he's married to somebody that the rest of the family seems to not like. And so she's been writing to him, complaining about how the family's been treating her. Clearly, we don't have her letters, but you can tell from the way Hekanacht is responding. And he's telling both his people who are working for him and his larger household, as well as his family members, that they need to cut it out, essentially. And he actually says at one point, like, look, it's known how you're supposed to treat a man's wife. You should treat her this way. And it's actually one of the things that I run some programs for learning to read ancient Egyptian, and it's Hakanacht's letters. We've read parts of them, including that part, because I think it's such a wonderful window into this thing that you just don't get anywhere else, really, in terms of seeing these relationships between people. And he talks about how hard it is at the time economically. He lays out salaries for everybody in the household. And part of the way he justifies that pay is by saying how difficult everything is right now. And he even says, at one point, look, they're starting to eat people here. Basically as a trying to drive home how hard the economic times are. And the drama in his household was so engaging that actually Agatha Christie was inspired to write a novel set in ancient Egypt based on Hekanacht's family. Death Comes as the End, of course, which is sold, I forget how many copies, like in the billions, I think, at this point. So she changed all the names in it, so people don't usually know Hekanacht's name, but he's actually wildly famous through that book, even though people don't realize that that's actually who inspired the story.
Excellent. And you've mentioned it a couple of times, but stories like this appear on your podcast, Voices of Ancient Egypt. So very simply, for those who might be interested in my audience, what is Voices of Ancient Egypt, and what are you trying to tell in this particular podcast?
So I started the podcast as another way to reach people, because I have already also a YouTube channel, also called Voices of Ancient Egypt, and social media accounts on Instagram and Facebook and, expected places. And I actually had thought about starting a podcast for a long time. People have often asked me if I would start a podcast. I resisted it for a while, and I've finally dove in recently. And this is part of my effort to I feel like I've always been really wanting to kind of fill a gap when it comes to Egyptology. This is why I started the YouTube channel originally and why I'm continuing to expand with these things, because I find not only did I, of course, when I was starting out, have almost no resources to go to at that time,
Mm.
internet was not really quite a thing yet. At that point, I mean, it technically existed, but we didn't have much on it. And nowadays, then I found also when I started out thinking about wanting to reach more people, I was looking around on the internet and I felt like everything was either very introductory and kind of repetitive, like a lot of websites just repeated the same things over and over again. And then on the other end, you had the really specialized material, that's really meant for academics. And there really wasn't much in between. And that's what I set out to try to fill. I wanted to reach more people because I was
Mhm.
teaching in the classroom at my university and doing sometimes some public outreach talks, but there's a limit to how many people I could reach that way.
Mhm.
So I realized that really, the internet was the best way to do this now. So initially with videos on YouTube and now with the podcast, that's what I've really wanted to do with this and be able to bring a wide variety of things about ancient Egypt to people, everything from the things we've been talking about in terms of the subjects of society and family to religious beliefs to the language and reading hieroglyphs and all of these. And I talk about this whole sort of variety of topics on the podcast in terms of, religious beliefs, burial, things like the story of Hakanaksh. And I've had an episode on heart scarabs recently also. And I talk about also, in addition to that, things about reading the language and how to go about learning hieroglyphs and the strategies for that. And I also interview a very like what you would, I guess, think of as sort of just, our everyday normal people who are learning to read Egyptian.
Mm.
They're not people who are pursuing their PhD and stuff, but are learning how to read this and learning from them what's been working for them with that, because this is a classically very challenging language and script to learn. And in the future, I'm also looking to have sometimes some interviews with other Egyptologists as well.
Mhm. Excellent. So, for those who are interested, you can find Dr. Nelson-Hurst's work at Voices of Ancient Egypt, both in podcast and YouTube format. So, Melinda, thank you very much for coming on the show. I look forward to listening to more episodes of Voices of Ancient Egypt. I think it's off to a really strong start. So, all the best, and I hope it turns out really well.
Thank you so much. And I think for anybody who enjoys your podcast, I know that they love to geek out about the same kinds of things too. So I think it will be wonderful to be in this same space together.
And now, here is a special preview of the Voices of Ancient Egypt podcast with your host, Dr. Melinda Nelson-Hurst.
Now, because the god resided in a statue that was within a shrine in a sanctuary deep in the temple, this is a place that's much further in from where most people were allowed. And so this was not a place where people came to worship. And one thing that I often think about, actually, when we think about things like this, as well as some like things like religious texts, for example, is that probably a lot more people actually enter these spaces today than ever did in ancient times. And it's kind of a mind-boggling thing when you think about it that way. It really was not used as the kind of space we often kind of think of. So that begs the question, of course, is then how did people communicate with the gods? How did they make their needs and wishes known? How did they make offerings for the gods or otherwise honor them? So this could be done in a variety of places, actually, and in different ways. I mentioned you can't go deep into the temple for the most part. However, the very first courtyard that you would encounter when coming in through the main gateway was generally a more accessible place. So this is where a lot of statues would be set up, not just necessarily statues of the god, but actually statues of humans, usually deceased, but sometimes they might be the current rulers, for example, or other officials who were pretty wealthy. And you could have these sort of statues that we refer to as intercessory statues. This means that they can intercede on your behalf. So these were statues you could come and visit and bring offerings to and let them know what your concerns were, your prayers, and they were going to take those prayers to the god for you because they had greater access to the god than you did. So you see this with certain non-royal individuals like the man named Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who was an official who worked under Amenhotep III. And he had a bunch of statues of himself set up here. And they even say on them that you can come bring your prayers to him and bring an offering, and he will bring your prayers to the god because he has access. But a lot of the access that ancient Egyptians had to the gods was outside the temples. And I mean, a lot of people didn't live super close to a really big temple, right? So you had to have other ways to access the god. Now, if you did live near a temple, a large one, or even a smaller one, perhaps even some of the smaller chapels, you could have occasional festivals throughout the year. So some festivals were annual, just once a year. Some festivals happen on a regular monthly basis. It depends on the festival. And during these festivals, the god in the temple, or sometimes there's multiple gods in the temple, would come out and parade around as part of the festival proceedings. So there were times that this happened, and festivals were really a fun and quite complex affairs that included this procession that oftentimes also reenacted some of the mythology of the god. And people attended these because they were great communal experiences as well as getting close to the god. You also would be out there with everybody from your local area. There was tons of food, alcohol, music, and dancing. Some of these festivals and parts of these festivals are sort of similar to some of our modern festivals in different parts of the world. You could think of perhaps Carnival or Mardi Gras, the Day of the Dead, different festivals like that. Sham el-Nessim in Egypt, for example. A lot of these have similarities with the ancient festivals as well. Now, during these processions, the god's statue would come out and be carried around in its shrine within a boat. The boat was typically carried, though. Sometimes these boats would actually ride on the water, but for the most part, they were carried by priests. And it's interesting because you could get really close to the god compared to usual in the temple, but the gods were still not visible. The statues themselves were inside a shrine with veiled cloth around them. We see this in depictions of festivals on temple walls where there's always a curtain sort of covering the shrine here. But while the god was out, in addition to simply seeing the god process by, sometimes the god would stop and make oracular pronouncements, and you'd be allowed to address a question to the god, either during festivals or sometimes the god statue came out at other times specifically to answer questions. And the god's boat would sway forward for yes or backwards for no. So these oracles could happen at a variety of times. And in fact, one letter that survives from a person is actually about how they are upset that the god hasn't come out for a while to give an oracle and decide on a case that this person had. So this person says, we don't know their name, but they say, "When I was looking for you," meaning the god, "to tell you some affairs of mine, you happened to be concealed in your Holy of Holies, and there was nobody having access to you to send in to you. Now, as I was waiting, I encountered Hori, the scribe of the temple of Usermat-re-Miamun," that's Ramses III's mortuary temple, "and he said to me, 'I have access. So I am sending him in to you. See, you must discard seclusion today and come out in procession in order that you may decide upon the issues involving 7 kilts belonging to the temple of Horemheb, and also those 2 kilts belonging to the necropolis scribe. The vizier does not accept these garments, saying, quote, 'It is because you must make up their number in full,' end quote. Now, as for the one who is in the same position as you, being in a place of seclusion and concealed, he sends forth his pronouncements. But you haven't yet communicated anything at all to me. See here, you let 11 garments accrue to the woman named Ise, your devotee, by your intervening on account of them. But now it happens that your pronouncements no longer come forth, as though confined in the netherworld for 1,000,000 years. Farewell." So as you can see, this is a fairly scathing letter that this person is writing. We're not sure if it's a man or a woman, perhaps a woman, and she's saying that she has this dispute over a number of kilts that's supposed to be delivered to these different temples and things, and the god won't come out to make a decision on who is right in this case. And she is admonishing him for that, and the fact that he has done this for others, but he's not doing it now when she is in need. So you can see there was an expectation also between people and the gods that there would be this kind of relationship where the god is going to decide things. And you could have gods decide not just personal matters, but legal cases as well. So Part of this is probably because to have the local god decide a legal case could avoid the social awkwardness of the humans having to decide a case where everyone really knew each other in the local area and nobody necessarily wanted to accuse somebody else or have to testify. But everybody kind of knew, including the priests who were holding that shrine of the god when they were going to sway forward or back, right? So you might still call this really the humans deciding, depending on how you want to look at it. But it was a way of avoiding any kind of direct accusation and testimony. But they were asked about other things too, not just court cases about property or criminal issues. They were also asked about various things. So here's an example of a list of questions that were written out to ask the god when they came out to give an oracle. So one says, remove him from the post of deputy of the gang, which is meant for a yes or no answer here. Another one says, my lord, my good lord, he really said this? Or, my good lord, shall we be given rations? This one's sort of acting as more of asking for a prediction rather than a decision. Now, another one asks for a property dispute decision. It says, as to the cattle that woman is claiming, does she have a share in them? So again, asking the god to decide in a legal property case. Another is referring to sort of more personal concerns where they say, as to the dreams that one sees, are they good? So they mean their own dreams. They're not just talking generally about dreams that one sees, but certain dreams that they've had. They want to know, are they meant to be a good sign? Another one says, shall I burn it? Shall I not burn it? Another one related to property says, will the place be given to Mena as she intends? So again, this seems to be probably some kind of inheritance dispute. A lot of times we don't really get the full context because people who had these questions and perhaps had them written down for a priest to ask knew that the god would know what the circumstance was, right? You don't have to write out a whole long explanation about what's going on. The god is going to know. So they don't explain it. So unfortunately for us today who don't have the omnipotence of a god and the, being able to see everything that's going on, we are not able to understand the full context of most of these issues. But it gives us a picture into how these oracles of the gods functioned and how people basically moved forward with their lives and in society and kept the peace to some extent by having the god decide these things. Now, people could also worship at home and also at various small shrines and stuff in the area. So in homes, we see certain small objects such as figurines shaped like certain animals or certain gods, and sometimes even steely, these little slabs either made out of wood or stone or other materials that were meant as sort of targets of worship, you could say. And some steely in homes even had ears carved on them so that the gods could literally hear them. I like this way that Emily Teeter has referred to these, where she says that they were like, quote, private lines to the god that could be activated at any time, end quote. So you had these various objects people could use other places too. You didn't have to go to a temple or wait for an oracle for everything, right? You could appeal to the gods, bring offerings, say things to them, even from the privacy of your own home. Now, there were also numerous sacred locations at other places, such as small shrines for different gods, that the locations usually had something to do with the particular way that these gods were envisioned and what they were involved with. For example, one dedicated to Merit Seger, who was a desert goddess who was worshipped by people at Deir el-Medina, who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. She's envisioned as a cobra goddess, and she had a shrine carved into the rock in that area between the village of Deir el-Medina and where the tombs were being carved in the Valley of the Kings. So a natural place for this to be in terms of her role in helping to protect them and provide for them. And it's also sort of on the way to that place. So you have certain local shrines like that, and sometimes you have them attached to other religious institutions as well, but they might be standalone kind of in the middle of nowhere like that one. One in particular was dedicated to Hathor at the site of Deir el-Bahri, also on the west bank of ancient Thebes or modern Luxor, where the excavator of the place, named Corelli, found what he called, quote, basketfuls worth of small votive objects in the shape of genitalia. The most common were especially male genitalia or phalli. And we don't know all the details of why people deposited these items or even exactly how, like were they deposited over time or was it a group ritual where a lot of them were deposited at the same time? But these are considered votive offerings, along with a smaller number of ones that also were shaped like female figurines. And because of this, we think these votive offerings were probably associated with fertility. Now, votives could be shaped in a lot of different ways depending on the context. They're usually either shaped in a way that relates to the god that you're appealing to, or in a way that relates to what you might be asking for help for or thanking them for help for. So in this case, it seems like probably people were asking for help with fertility and or thanking for help with fertility. Now, another type of votive that you might be familiar with and seen in museums is animal mummies. So yes, these are a votive offering as well, most of them. Now, there are a smaller number of animal mummies that were for different purposes, but most of the ones you're going to see in collections are these votive offerings. And this is because it became common practice in the first millennium BCE, so this is fairly late in ancient Egyptian history, for temples to raise animals that were a type of animal associated with the god of that temple. And they raised them for the purpose of then killing them and wrapping them up, sometimes fully mummifying them, sometimes not really so much, but just wrapping them, and then selling them to people who came to visit the temple and wished to leave a votive offering for the god. And by offering this animal that was associated with the god, they were, in a sense, returning this animal to the god, and the animal could then carry their prayer to the god for them. So this became a common practice in those later times. And votive offerings can come in lots of different forms, but this is probably the most common one you're going to encounter in museum locations. So the ancient Egyptians could encounter their gods in lots of different ways, lots of different places, all these ones I've mentioned. There's also sort of less intentional encounters with God.